The Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas blog have reaffirmed concern over the United States blockade on Cuba. The Minneapolis policeman who killed George Floyd in 2020 has been sentenced to 22.5 years in prison. And 1 out of 4 Cubans have received at least 1 dose of the domestically developed ALBA COVID-19 vaccine. Hello and welcome to TeleSUR. I'm Jose Daniel Lopez in Quito, Ecuador, and this is from the south. We start in Venezuela, where the 19th summit of the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America, or ALBA, was held. In the final declaration, the heads of state rejected unilateral sanctions and blockades against Cuba and Venezuela, highlighted the achievements of Cuba in producing world-class COVID-19 vaccines, and rejected the destabilization attempts against the government of Nicaragua. They also announced political initiatives to strengthen regional autonomous mechanisms, such as the Union of South American States and SELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean countries. The summit took place along with the anniversary of the Carabobo battle, which sealed the Venezuelan independence in 1821. During this summit, Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro talked about the possible scenario of a world without empires.
This here is the 21st century, no doubt that the one that marks the end of all empires. It will be the century of the rising of a world of peace, a humane world, as our singer Ali Primera said, so humanity can be humane.
On the other hand, the Prime Minister of Dominica, Roosevelt Skerrit, rejected foreign intervention in the democratic governments such as Bolivia and Venezuela. Skerrit himself was the target of a failed destabilization scheme in 2019, orchestrated by the head of the Organization of American States, Luis Almagro.
What has happened here in Venezuela and what has happened in Bolivia should never be allowed to happen anywhere else, where these interventionist attitudes believe that they must dictate to the people who are their leadership, who should lead them and when they should lead them. But we should not allow them, as citizens of this region, to decide where we stand on the decision based on who is in government or how they lead.
Raul González, Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, praised the late revolutionary leaders Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez for bringing together the Bolivarian Alliance.
From the beginning of ALBA-TCP, from the inaugural meeting until today, so I know for a son the heroic work of Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez, I can write a book about it, as to how this came about and what transpired. And this is an extraordinary organization, ALBA-TCP. It is an integration movement of the highest quality, benefiting the free and independent people across the Caribbean and Latin American civilization, and what we engage in daily in our struggle for survival and the improvement of the life of our people, the quality of those lives, our living and production.
Meanwhile, Grenada and Venezuela have reached bilateral agreements in food crop production and agricultural research. The agreement is the result of a bilateral meeting between the agricultural ministers of Grenada, David Helm, and Venezuela, Wilmer Castro. They met during the Bolivarian Trade Agreement ALBA Summit held in Caracas on Thursday. They also discussed trading agricultural production for both countries. Following the meeting, the officials visited a small goat farm located in a residential area of the Venezuelan capital.
National consultation on agriculture in St.
1 out of 4 Cubans have been vaccinated against COVID-19, with more than 5 million doses applied so far using the Abdala jab. Health authorities in the country announced that so far 24% of the population has been immunized with at least 1 dose of the COVID-19 vaccine. According to a study carried out by England's Oxford University, Cuba currently leads the percentage of people vaccinated in a day per 100 inhabitants. This is the result of an effective alliance between industry, research centers, and the public health system, the study says. Cuba has developed 5 vaccines, of which 2 have reached the final 3rd stage of testing. One of them, called Abdala, has proven a 92% efficiency in preventing the disease.
We believe that Cuba will be the first country to be able to vaccinate its entire population by 2021 with its own vaccines. We will have to see what will happen with the efficacy of the sum of 2 doses of Soberana O2 and 1 dose of Soberana Plus, which is what we will present to our regulatory authority when we have this final data.
Meanwhile, Venezuela has received the first batch of the Abdala COVID-19 vaccine developed in Cuba. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez received the shipment, which is part of the agreement signed between Venezuela and Cuba for the development of 12 million doses of the Abdala vaccine against the coronavirus. This comes after the scientific community confirmed the vaccine candidate has shown efficiency of more than 92%. Cuban ambassador to Venezuela, Dagoberto Rodriguez, stressed that the agreement is part of the close relations and solidarity between the two countries. In the United States, Minneapolis policeman Derek Chauvin was sentenced to 22.5 years in prison for the murder of George Floyd in May 2020. Judge Peter Cahill's sentence underlined the officer's cruelty and abuse of his position of authority, aggravating factors that allow him to give a harsher sentence. During the arrest of George Floyd in May 2020, Chauvin suffocated his victim, pressing his knee against Floyd's neck, who several times shouted he was unable to breathe. The murder sparked a national wave of anti-racist protests, promptly demanding for structural reforms of police departments and rules. Chauvin's sentence was one of the longest given a former police officer for using illegal deadly force in the United States. More news in a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back. During the UN General Assembly on Wednesday, a total of 184 countries voted in favor of a resolution to demand the end of the U.S. economic blockade on Cuba for the 29th year in a row, with the United States and Israel voting against. And after the meeting ended, Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez had an exclusive interview with our special reporter in New York City, Isa Garcia, and said that the blockade was a massive, flagrant, and unacceptable violation of the human rights of the Cuban people.
How are you? As you already know, 184 countries voted for Cuba, leaving the United States alone with its policy of blockading the island. 60 years of the embargo, and here we are, to have a conversation with the Foreign Minister of Cuba, Bruno Rodriguez, who came to the United Nations headquarters once again. For the 29th time, Cuba says no to the embargo. And 184 countries have her back. Were you expecting this overwhelming majority, Foreign Minister?
Yes, an overwhelming majority, without a doubt. Yes, but it is a surprising figure in times of COVID, of international economic crisis, at a time when there is a new government in the United States, a changing international environment. We even knew that from the point of view of the delegations present in the chamber. It was going to take place under different conditions, but we were absolutely certain that the overwhelming majority that exists in reality would also be expressed in the vote. I remember in the years, the first time this resolution was presented, it did not reach majority and was withdrawn in 1991. In 1992, it reached a small minority of around 50 or so votes and has been growing to a situation of practically unanimity in the member states of the United Nations. This is a very encouraging result, not only for the Cuban people, because when the blockade is debated in the United Nations General Assembly, the right to sovereignty, to peace, to development, to the enjoyment of human rights of all the people on the planet, and especially of the Cuban homeland, is being defended.
I was surprised by the fact that many of the countries who spoke today mentioned the success that Cuba has had in the development of its vaccines, and it is a good thing that the island has the ALBA vaccine, which is one of the 4 most effective in the world, and I was also amazed by the fact that they recognized the cooperation that Cuba has provided with the medical aid brigades. How do you feel about this?
Touched, one realizes it is a sincere feeling, that it is a recognition to a small and blockaded island, which, in a very annoying and discreet way, fulfills its duty of cooperation with its fellow countries of the South that need it so much, particularly in the field of public health. It has been this way for many years. It was extraordinary and symbolic during the Ebola epidemic in West Africa. And it has also happened during the COVID-19. And it seems to me that it is a fair tribute to the Cuban health personnel, who have done a task and keep doing it every minute, heroically in our country, and also since the beginning of the pandemic. They offered their expertise to other nations. But not only did 57 brigades of the Henry Reeve Medical Brigade arrived in more than 40 countries and territories, but already in the southern nations that were at the time more than 28,000 health professionals in 59 nations when the COVID-19 outbreak occurred. It was reiterated. It was emotional to hear that from our brothers in Latin America, and especially in the Caribbean, but also to hear it from African, Asian countries, and especially from the small Pacific islands.
We also heard the United States representative said that the U.S. maintains the blockade against Cuba precisely to defend human rights on the island. How would you respond to that?
Well, he did not talk about vaccines, not about COVID-19. And I think he did very well in not referring to that uncomfortable topic for his country. Because it is unfortunate that a country as rich as the United States has had a record number of COVID-19 cases and deaths. A record in relative and almost absolute terms. Knowing that about half of the deaths could have been avoided with other policies, with preventive measures, with a stronger public health system, with universal health coverage, with health coverage for the tens of millions of US Americans who do not have health insurance, or the huge differences to the detriment of the African American and Latinos, which should not have occurred. The minorities who have the biggest infection and death rates within the general population of the United States. And well, close to the voting, we heard the excellent news of the high efficacy of Abdala and Soberana O2 vaccines. And well, that is why the delegations expressed themselves the way they did. The United States speech seemed boring to me. It is a traditional speech. It is true that, as I have heard many of those speeches in person, I am grateful that it was brief, but there is no doubt that it departs from the truth. Because, in the first place, if the United States government really had any interest in the human rights situation of Cubans, the first thing it could do is to lift the blockade, which is an obvious, massive, flagrant, systematic violation of the human rights of every Cuban, of Cubans residing in the United States, and also denies the right of every US American by restricting their freedom to travel to Cuba And of course, the government of the United States has no moral authority to speak about human rights violations in Cuba. It does so with a degree of political maneuvering, manipulation, and ideological approach with no credibility, and that has no international support. And yet, the government of the United States has very good reasons to sign international agreements on human rights. It is a developed country that has signed the fewest international conventions protecting human rights. It could recognize the right to food, it could sign the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it could recognize the right to peace, the right to development, and it would have to start by modifying the terrible, structural, systematic pattern of racism, of police brutality. And if I wanted to talk about political law, well, I would have to start by talking about what has happened in this country in the last year, which has been tremendous. The great polarization of US society, the hatred speech. That is, the United States has no moral authority to talk about human rights, and when they talk about this in Cuba, they do so with great hypocrisy and cynicism, and therefore nobody believes it.
Speaking about the United States government, the 243 coercive measures imposed by former President Donald Trump, who lost the presidential elections in last November, are still in force. But current President Joe Biden, who won those elections, he keeps these measures. What do you think is happening? Biden promised to do things differently.
This is a question his voters could be asking themselves as well, taking into consideration all that was said during the campaign. This is a question that Cubans who reside in the United States and vote for a new government could be asking themselves as well, I imagine. And it is paradoxical that the current US government is still fully enforcing all the blockade terms. Of the 243 measures imposed by former President Donald Trump, of the more than 50 measures imposed against Cuba during the COVID-19 pandemic, which are cruel and opportunistic, a merciless opportunism that prey on a pandemic and an international economic crisis to impose a policy of maximum pressure. There are people in the United States who believe the blockade is a mistake, for many reasons. The most realistic ones recognize the blockade has not fulfilled its purpose, that it isolates the United States rather than Cuba, which caused them problems even with their international partners. There is no doubt that the inertial effect of continuing to impose policies of a government that was the opposite of the current one, with a totally different speech, with a different approach to the current one, surely leads people to wonder what's going on. It might be one of those chatty events that take place within political elites. It might be, to some extent, a voting issue. But there is no doubt that we should be concerned in the sense that the effect of continuing those inherited policies could be shaping and living without a policy of its own, a US government that has proposed to change the country, to resolve polarization, to modify foreign policy, so that when you have the opportunity to interview President Biden or his Secretary of State, It would be a very good question.
Finally, I would like you to tell us about the effects of the blockade during the last 60 years, about the damages. In your speech, you mentioned the blockade is an economic war of extraterritorial reach. What does this mean?
The effect is enormous. The human damage cannot be counted. It is immeasurable. It is extraordinary. It reaches every Cuban family. It reaches Cubans living in the United States and in other countries. In Cuba, it causes shortages, deprivation, suffering, anxiety. It affects all aspects of life, health, education, food. In other words, it is a fact that it is omnipresent in the lives of the Cubans already for several generations. But the cruelest of all has been the tightening of the blockade in the year 2019 and 2020, which continues until now, destined precisely to take advantage of the terrible circumstances that humanity is experiencing to try to wrest concessions from Cuba, or to cause additional damage to our population, amounting in this short period to more than $5 billion. For a small and underdeveloped economy like ours, which makes feasts such as providing universal education, health, employment, social security, or progresses such as producing 5 vaccine candidates, to place 3 of them in health testings, with 4 million doses jabbed to more than 2 million Cubans, or to have 2 of them with tested efficacy. There is no doubt that behind all this there is an enormous effort. I mean, the fact that Swiss companies, because they were subsidiaries of US companies, they could not export medical ventilators to Cuba. It is an atrocity.
Is this one of the extraterritorial effects of the embargo?
The accumulated damages, $147 billion. That is an enormous figure for a country like Cuba. And the blockade is in no way, as mentioned by the delegate, Mr. Hunter, the United States delegate today in the General Assembly, a bilateral matter, or a decision by the United States to trade more or less with Cuba. The blockade, and anyone who has doubts would find enough information on the Helms-Burton Act or the Torricelli Act. The blockade is aimed at third countries. It has an extraterritorial effect from which no one on this planet can escape, because of the weight of the US economy, because of the weight of its financial and banking system. It deeply harms its own allies. It violates their sovereignty. It subjects them to the decisions of the US courts. It exports their national law. It imposes the application of national law in European countries. It is inconceivable. And Title Number 3 of the Helms-Burton Act is fundamentally of an extraterritorial scope. So it is not a bilateral issue in any way. It is an issue of international law, a violation of human rights, a violation of universal trade rules, of restriction of the freedom of navigation that affects the interests of any company on the planet, and of course one would expect a more vigorous practical action, especially from developed countries, which have a close relationship with the United States and whose interests are being tremendously affected.
Definitely, the extraterritorial character of the blockade knows no borders. It affects everyone in the world. 3 words to define the blockade:
Inhuman, extraterritorial, and I have to think of it as a virus. I have to think of it as a pandemic. It affects the whole planet. It affects Cubans. The blockade, like the virus, suffocates. The blockade, like the virus, kills. And I am sure that it will have to end because it is the will of the Cuban people, because it is the will of the international community, and because the majority of US citizens and the majority of Cubans residing in the United States want it to be lifted. So I am convinced that this will happen. We are prepared to resist for as long as it takes, and not only resist, but also move forward and develop with or without the blockade.
I will add a 4th word: anachronistic. Definitely. It was mentioned in the United Nations General Assembly by many countries who defended Cuba and supported your speech.
It is anachronistic, but it was never fair, legitimate, or legal. It is true that it would not be a bad idea for those who want to asphyxiate Cuba to think about this, because the blockade has proven to achieve no result in 60 years, and whether that in itself is no reason enough to try different paths.
It is food for thought. Let's hope that United States President Joe Biden listens to us. A president that defended the normalization of bilateral relations when he was vice president during Barack Obama's term. Now everything indicates that he is turning away from that path. Thank you, Foreign Minister, for your time.
Many thanks to TeleSUR and you.
And with this exclusive interview with Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez, we come to the end of this news brief. But remember, you can find this and many other stories in our website at telesurenglish.net. And don't forget to join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For TeleSUR English, I'm Jose Daniel Lopez. Thank you for watching.